Good morning, Ran.
Good morning, Eli.
It's been 22 years, I think, since you started your activity in philosophical counseling.
That's right.
And about 20 years ago, you have collected and edited the first international English collection of articles in philosophical counseling.
That's true, yeah.
And about the same time, you were together with Lou Marinov, you organized the first international conference in philosophical counseling. Perhaps by now you can tell us what is philosophical about philosophical counseling.
Obviously, we cannot have a clear definition of what is philosophy. And also, we obviously don't have a definition that applies, that everybody would agree on. But I think we can describe in a general way what are the themes that have to be more or less in a counseling in order to count as philosophical. And there are some answers that are floating in the field that I think are not very good answers. For example, I can hear some people saying that what is special about philosophical counseling, what is philosophical in philosophical counseling, is that we don't impose anything on the counselee. We give him or her space. We let him or her express themselves. Now, letting yourself express yourself is very nice, but it's not philosophical in any specific way. When I compare the great philosophers, is that what they did? Obviously not. So I think that this is not a good answer to this question. Or another kind of answer that I can hear in the field is that what we do is we analyze, we do critical thinking, we expose assumptions, and we analyze concepts to little conditions, pieces. But again, if I look at what the great philosophers did, they did much more than that. This is not really philosophical practice because a lot of people do critical thinking, not only philosophers.
So now we have a better idea what philosophical counseling is not. Could you be more positive and tell us what it is?
Okay. Well, in the most general sense, one can say that philosophical counseling or philosophical practice in general is about the basic issues of life. Philosophy, what it does is it deals with the fundamental issues of life. What is love? What is meaning? What does it mean to know? What is the self? What is a relationship? But this is a very general characterization. And it's not unique to philosophy. After all, theologians, religious people, psychologists also deal with the same issues.
And what is your answer?
I think that the answer to what is philosophical, what does it mean to say that it's philosophical, the answer can be found if we look at the history of philosophy. If we look at all the philosophers, the rationalists and the non-rationalists, the ancient and the modern, all important philosophers, and mediocre philosophers as well. Kant and Hegel and Bergson and Plato, everyone, I think, what they did was they didn't only analyze or do critical thinking. Rather, they constructed theories or ways of understanding or worldviews. Or to put it in another way, all philosophers constructed networks of ideas that gave meaning or sense to those issues. And by networks of ideas, I mean concepts, distinctions, assumptions that created a certain view that made sense of the issue in question.
So in a way, constructing new ideas in a relevant way is relevant also to philosophical counseling?
Then it must be there if it is to be philosophical. Without that, without constructing networks of ideas, of understanding that give meaning to make sense of the issue, I don't see why it's philosophical. But I should add some qualifications. The construction of networks of ideas in philosophy, which is called philosophizing, has to be, first of all, it has to be creative. It's not just taking a network of ideas from somebody else and applying it to this case. So if a philosophical counselor takes Aristotle and says, oh, you are this, or takes Sartre and says, you're this, this is not really philosophizing, it's just applying a philosophical theory to the counselee. So it has to be creative. It also has to be dialogical. In other words, philosophizing means that you are in a dialogue with previous philosophers. There is a wealth of wisdom in the history of philosophy, and all philosophers went forward. They reacted to previous philosophers. They used previous ideas. So, for example, Aristotle is a reaction to Plato, and Kant is a reaction to David Hume. So any kind of philosophy has to be also dialogical, and it also has to be critical. In other words, I construct my network of ideas not on the basis of faith, for example, as in religion, not on the basis of scientific evidence, as in science, but in a critical way. So, to sum up, it seems to me that a very important theme in philosophy that makes philosophy philosophy is that you construct networks of ideas that shed light on basic issues of life in a creative, dialogical, and critical way.
So now that we have a general idea of what is philosophical about philosophical counseling, perhaps you could give us an example.
In my approach to counseling and to philosophical practice in general, the point is not to find solutions to answers. The point is not to direct people to how to solve their problem or how to become happier. That I leave to psychologists and to coaches. My role is what philosophy is all about, is to enrich our life, to look at life more deeply, to open ourselves to bigger horizons. And so in order to open ourselves to bigger horizons, self-understanding is extremely important.
That's very, very, very interesting. Could you give us a specific example that you remember now?
Yes. So, for example, several years ago, I had a counselee in her late 40s that came to me with a feeling that life is somehow going nowhere for her, that she really hadn't lived life, that she's not doing anything of significance. And we started to talk about it. And as usual, my purpose with that person is not to make her happy or to tell her what to do so that she can find some meaning in life, but rather, first of all, to look at herself, to understand her way that she interprets the world, because we all interpret our world all the time. I'm not talking about general opinions or declarations, but in the way that we react with people, in the way that we do all kinds of small activities, we are constructing a world. And so the question is, what is your world? And to understand this world is really to create a theory, if you want, a network of ideas that would express the way that she relates to her world. So what we did, we started to look at very specific events that happened this morning, that happened yesterday, that happened last year. And we tried to see what kind of relationship she has with the outside world and also with herself. And it became quite clear already at the beginning. This usually happens in the first two sessions, that things are starting to get clear, that her everyday behavior, many small events, reflect the same basic interpretation of the world, the same basic theory, you can say. And this is that she lives only to the extent that someone looks at her, that it's from the outside, from an outside look, that she is confirmed and that she gets meaning. And this expresses itself in small events such as, for example, she was an agent in a travel agency, and she got an offer to start a new branch. They opened a new branch and she could be a boss there, not just an agent among other agents, but a boss. And she didn't want that. And she felt, what am I going to do there? It's going to be meaningless, boring. And of course, if you understand the entire picture, you can see that the reason is that if you don't have a boss, you don't have anybody to look at you and judge you and evaluate you and say, oh, you're very nice or very good. This is an example, one of many examples that express the same idea. I'll give you another example. She said one day that a couple of days ago, on the weekend, she was at the beach and she walked on the beach. And she tells me, oh, it was so beautiful. the way my red dress looked against the background of the yellow beach. And if you think about it, she didn't say, oh, it was so peaceful, that is something about her inside, but rather how she looks from the outside. And so at this point, I suggested to her that many of the things that she said had the same theme, and maybe they express her general attitude. And this theme is that she is very concerned about how she looks from the outside. She's not necessarily afraid of how she looks from the outside, but it's very important to her. And so I said, let's read a little text. And we read a little text from Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre. The text is The Look, where Sartre defines the other. What does it mean to encounter an other? And the other in Sartre is a look from the outside that objectifies me. Somebody looks at me and he objectifies me. That means he tries to make me a thing in his world. And I, of course, look at him and I objectify him. So the encounter with the other is a kind of battle between two looks. I look at him, he looks at me. And at first she said, the first reaction was, oh yes, that seems exactly like me. And this is a common reaction, that people say, oh yes, I'm exactly like this philosophy. But for me, the reaction is, well, let's look at it more deeply. Because nobody really fits exactly into some theory, right? Nobody is exactly Jean-Paul Sartre. So so we stopped and we looked at it, and indeed it became quite clear that she is not, she doesn't have exactly that picture, because unlike in Sartre, her relation to the other is not that of objectifying. She doesn't feel shamed, objectified, like in Sartre's philosophy. Rather, she uses that. She manipulates the other by being the object of look. She gives meaning to her life, to things that she does. Oh, that's good, that's nice, that's meaningful, by manipulating and playing with the others. So that means that we had to reconstruct her understanding of herself. In other words, we used as raw materials, we used Sartre and we used other philosophers. None of them applied exactly to her. But we took distinctions, we took concepts, and this dialogue with other philosophers helped us to construct her world, how she interprets her world.
Could you just tell us, how did it all end? Is there a happy end?
Yes. When we hear those case studies, we want them to end nicely, and at the end she went home happily ever after. For me, this is not the case, because I'm not trying to solve problems. Rather, I'm working on self-understanding and self-growth, opening ourselves beyond our little world, beyond our little Platonic cave, and so it never ends. So what happened in this case was, for several sessions, we worked on understanding her worldview, the way she constructed her world. We used other philosophers for that. And then the issue was how to open herself beyond that. And what we did, we worked on other voices that exist in her. Because, of course, a person is never only one theory. And this woman was also more. So we explored these other voices. At that time, I was working at Haifa University half a year and half a year in the United States, so I had to leave. But for me, it's a fine ending, because this is part of life, self-understanding. We did several months of work like that, and she continued, I hope she continued to work on herself, on understanding herself, and opening herself to wider horizons.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ran. I think we have a better idea of what is philosophical in philosophical counseling by now. Thank you.
Thank you, Eli.